The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists, to AP Economics presented by Cobranomics, your all-American history teacher, gold standard of economics, and sensei of supply side, Professor G here, and today we are going to take a look at Unit 4, Lesson 2, continuing our look at the full employment graph and our introduction to the founder of our course, John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics. And the full employment graph goes through an important evolution today, because for the first couple of hundred years, there was the classical economic model, really outlined by people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Jean-Baptiste Say. And it's Say who comes up with Say's law about how an economy looks graphically. And first, graphs are really important because for an economist, predicting the economy is like driving with only the rearview mirror and your front window blacked out, because an economist only has data that is previously available. All the data is a month to 3 months old. So how do economists make a prediction of what's going to happen? How are policies and exogenous shocks going to affect an economy? When in doubt, strike first and graph it out. And so today we are going to take a look at the evolution of the full employment graph. Well, we're going to start here. This is not going to be the model we end up with. So in the theory number 1, Say's law from Jean-Baptiste Say, and Say said that aggregate supply, the ability and willingness of businesses to produce, was vertically shaped. Why would it be vertically shaped? Say believed that production creates the income necessary to then, for consumers, for households, to buy the products. In other words, supply creates its own demand. When businesses produce something, the act of production in the factor market, as they pay for the resources of production, the factors of production, they are paying for the income which will then be used to buy the product. So, therefore, if there is an economic shock, these shocks will be short-lived because businesses will be able to adjust based on the changes to price, based on the input costs. So Say believed that business was able to produce regardless of price. For instance, if there was an increase in aggregate demand, creating what would be inflationary conditions, as the price increased, this for businesses would raise input costs, and businesses would therefore cut back on production, which would then limit the amount of spending that can occur in an economy, which would then bring the economy back to normal. This is why GDP remains constant. It's not increasing or decreasing as aggregate demand increases or decreases. It's so short-lived as businesses are able to respond due to the change in price affecting input costs. Inversely, if there is a decrease in aggregate demand, there is a negative economic shock. There is a decrease in spending in the economy. Aggregate demand decreases. This decreases price, which decreases input costs. As input costs decrease, businesses are able to hire more. And as they hire more, people now have more income those resources are paid, those households are paid, people now have more income, and that income re-stimulates the economy into the product market, around and around the circular flow model. So for Jean-Baptiste Say and the classical economists, all economic shocks and recessions and periods of inflation would graphically and theoretically be short-lived because they believed that aggregate supply, the ability and willingness to produce, was not really affected by prices in the long term or short term, that they believed that businesses were able to quickly adjust to the change in prices as the price changed input costs. And this was the operating theory for several hundred years until there was a problem, the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, there is the collapse of the stock market, the collapse of the banking system, which wipes out people's 5,000 banks closed over the course of 3 years. And that wipes out a third of the money in circulation. That wipes out savings accounts. There's 25% unemployment. It is a massive decrease in consumer spending and aggregate demand. 25% unemployment, even more underemployed. And prices are at an all-time low. Yet, the economy is not recovering. And that brings us to introduce our founder, John Maynard Keynes. And let me introduce you to the stylin' and profilin', wheelin' and dealin', limousine riding, John Maynard Keynes. And here he is to tell you about that why John Baptiste say, let me tell you something, Mean Gene, it is all wrong. We are going to redo this theory in light of the Great Depression. So John Maynard Keynes here, and here's the problem, Jean Baptiste say, with the theory that in the short run, aggregate supply, price level equals profit. You cannot underestimate the animalistic impulses of business, the animal instinct of business, that business is about survival. And what determines survival? Prices. Prices are profit. So, if aggregate demand, we have aggregate demand, we have equilibrium, but Great Depression, there is this massive decrease in aggregate demand. And here's what happens. Price. As people are less willing, less able to spend, massive unemployment, they're less willing, less able to spend, that means they're less willing, less able to offer a higher maximum price. They're going to have to pay less. And what do businesses do? Businesses don't just start producing on their own. They've already reached the maximum level of their production, as in the 1920s, the roaring 20s. And why would they start increasing production at a low price level? The problem is that prices come down, but this is the CPI. This are the consumer prices. Input costs are sticky. So, rent, wage, insurance, utilities, these aren't coming down with the price level, with the prices that consumers are willing and able to pay. Input costs are staying up here. Input costs are sticky. They travel slower than the consumer price index, than the CPI. So what happens to a business? The prices consumers are willing to pay are down here, but input costs are up here. So a business cannot break even. That means, what does a business have to do? A business has to decrease its production. And it won't just start increasing its production out of nowhere, just because the price level's down. So the original theory Sorry, Jean-Baptiste, but that is wrong. And that's why John Maynard Keynes is the founder of our course. To be the man, you've got to beat the man. And John Maynard Keynes is the man of the course. So, price level comes down, aggregate demand decreases. Price level comes down, and GDP comes down as well. And this now explains why 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932, things aren't getting better on their own, things are getting worse. And here you have a decrease in aggregate demand causes a decrease in prices and causes a decrease in GDP. Other couple of notes about the aggregate supply curve. It shifts because of changes to input costs. What are the determinants of aggregate supply? A little more simple than aggregate demand. It shifts because of your general input costs, costs of the resources and production, and just like regular supply, expectation of price. But Jean-Baptiste wasn't totally wrong. He was just wrong that aggregate supply existed all by itself. It exists in both a short term, a short run, SRAS, and it exists in a long run. So there are two aggregate supply curves on the graph. One, where we are, and two, where we want to be. And this is long run aggregate supply. This is essentially the PPC on a graph with a set of different parameters. Instead of being on a graph that represents two different goods or services and the opportunity costs of them, this is the PPC. This is where we want to be. This is full employment of resources and technology, full efficiency. And because if we are where we want to be, then an economy can adjust based on prices, because all of the resources are fully employed. And if all of those resources are fully employed, then an economy will be able to adjust, and GDP will be constant no matter of price level. But that's not where we operate. That's a long-term ideal goal. We operate in the short term, and therefore, when this happens, not to replace capitalism, but to push capitalism in the right direction, we're going to take a look at how can the government use fiscal policy, the power of taxation and spending, to kick aggregate demand in the right direction. Not to replace Adam Smith, not to replace Say, but to help capitalism along back to where it should be. And what we're going to continue to take a look at in the course is now putting all three together and using the full three-curve, full employment graph to visualize where we should be as an economy, what happens when there's exogenous shocks that change aggregate demand, and then how can the government use its fiscal policy to put us back to where we should be, where all three are aligned on LRAS. So this is the goal. The goal this is full employment. We want to be where we are. So we want where we are to be where we want to be. And yes, sometimes long-run aggregate supply shifts as well, just like for the PPC, same exact thing. They are the same concept, just on two different graphs. The change to the long-term quality or quantity of resources and technology will shift an entire graph to the right or an entire graph to the left, bringing AS with it. So when LRAS shifts, AS would come with it, but when aggregate supply shifts, it shifts by itself. So the goal is how do we get all three aligned when there is some exogenous shock that takes us away from where we are. And that's where the man, John Maynard Keynes, comes in, the founder of our course, to take a look at how we use fiscal policy and how we use the multiplier and the circular flow model to adjust aggregate demand to bring us back to where we're supposed to be. I'm Professor G. Thank you for watching. We will continue Keynesian economics with our special guest. And remember, invest hard, invest often, and no feelings. Money never sleeps.